is my place, and I am welcome.
Good morning, everybody. So glad to see you all. Let me just adjust my camera and let's go. So today, I don't usually focus on a person, but today I'm going to. And it's not someone that gets a lot of coverage in the Unity movement. His older brother actually has a couple books written about him. Haven't found a book about Rickert, number 2 son of our co-founders, but I've found enough that he inspired me for today's talk. So let's just get caught up on where we are with our 12 powers, which is our theme for today. And if you're new to Unity, 12 powers are a way of expressing spiritual gifts in a sort of a semi-organized way, which involves the body, involves a link to the apostles, which involves color, which allows us to have outer reminders of the spiritual self that we are. So far we've talked about faith and strength and wisdom and love and power. And the month of June, we'll be talking about imagination. And I know that the other speakers this month will fill in a lot of gaps about what is imagination and how to use it. I'm going to focus on how we got Unity's home, Unity Village. So let me start with a little thought about what imagination is. And this is from our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, written in his book, Prosperity. In our human understanding, we have divorced this imaging power from the mind, from the executive power. Now let us bring them together and unify them, for when imagination and will work together, all things are possible to humankind. And when I read this, I kind of had this little, you get those memories from when you were a kid. And I remember having an imagination was a bad thing. And that always puzzled me. And I found out, or at least I have a theory. I have a working theory. I can't prove it, but I have a working theory. In the old days of the King James Bible, imagination is the human ability to form mental images used, for example, in artistic creations. In the King James Version of the Bible, however, imagination refers to an evil purpose, plan, scheme, device, or argument, rather than a mental faculty or activity. And this is from a traditional Christian book that I had as a child. And that kind of, the idle mind is the work of the devil. Anybody else grow up with that idea? So I'm going to ask you to just, if you had that idea, if you grew up with that idea, can you just set it aside for the next few minutes? And let's focus on how we can use our imagination to live a much fuller life. So everything is created first in the mind, created twice, first in the mind, then in the outer. And if you go back into antiquities, even the ancient Greeks were saying this, and other spiritual scholars and teachers pretty well worldwide agree that most things happen first in the mind and then in expression. And here we can see an image showing where our imagination is located. It's in our third eye, which makes a lot of sense that that's how we see, that we can see from within to the without. It is through imagination that the formless takes form, and that's Charles's definition from his seminal work, 12 Powers. Imagination, though, cannot be forced. It must be invited. And I think that's something I kind of got as a kid. I was told I wasn't particularly creative. It's just that my definition of creativity and how I saw things didn't always match. I'd have a great idea for a painting as a child, and it never looked the way I had pictured it in my mind. Well, for some folks, they have a skill, they have the training, they have the talent. And number 2 son, Rickert, was one of those people. He actually went off to art school and got a lot of training both in the US and overseas in Europe as an artist, as a consultant, as someone who had beautiful ideas and had the knowledge and skill set to bring it into manifestation. So let me just introduce you to him in case you haven't heard of him before. So he was born in 1884 in Pueblo, Colorado. He's number two son, as I've said. In the middle, we see our three boys. In the front row, left to right, are Lowell, number one son, and Rickert. And then in the back is number three son, Royal, John Royal. And then on the right is a picture of Rickert with his wife Harriet and their children, Charles R. And most folks in Unity will call him Charles R. To distinguish him from his grandfather. And then Rosemary. Some of you may have seen Rosemary in Daily Word bits on TV or heard that she had done those. So they each of the children of Rickert went on into, shall we say, the family business. Charles R. in an administrative capacity, and Rosemary, you could also almost say she was the social media guru of the time. She was really big on finding ways to get Unity onto television and getting the message out that way. That's a whole other talk, and I'll give it some time. Now, Harriet died fairly young. Rosemary was still a teenager. She was still in school when that happened. Rickert never remarried. And I would submit that a lot of the energy that he would have had for a relationship was sort of transmuted into his artwork, into making things beautiful and practical. And that's what I love about Rickert, is that there is this balance, this dance of the prosaic and the beautiful. One of the first things he was involved in that I could find was the Unity Inn, which sadly burned down a couple of years ago. It replaced what had been a house at 10th and Tracy, and in downtown Kansas City, Missouri. It actually went to the other end of the street to 9th and Tracy, and that was sort of the common phrasing that you were going to 9th and Tracy for lunch. And I wish that we had photos in color, or someone had colorized them, because he did this beautiful job. If you've been at Unity Village and seen in the older buildings, particularly the old Fillmore Chapel, the beauty and the ability to balance, beauty with not only prosaic, but that fine line between ostentatiousness and deep spiritual beauty. So that was one of the first projects he worked on. Now he served during World War I, and when he came home, there was kind of a sense that Unity was outgrowing its space on Tracy. And there was no place to move. They already had pretty well all the land from 9th Street to 10th Street. And they were as far back along the block as they could get, short of, expropriating other properties. So the decision was made to go out into the county. And the story is written that they had gone out to investigate a property that was about 40 acres. And the property, it was discovered, had already been sold, but the agent who was responsible for that sale was still hanging around. And they went up to him and, started talking about that they were interested in some property outside of the city. Now, if you've been to Unity Village, you know that it's actually within the city now, but at the time, it was 16 miles away. There was lots of green space between it and the city. And so they said to the agent something to the effect of, "We should like a piece of rolling country, good for planting with water on it and some woodland, and with fruit trees perhaps, or space where an orchard can be set out. We want a small place that can be developed, beautified, and made to pay its way. A pleasant, restful rural spot removed from city noises and confusion, and at the same time, not too far out for quick travel back and forth." Now, I'm sure any real estate agent listening to this is kind of rolling their eyes at, and how much more do you want? But the thing was, the agent had a piece of property that met that need. Nice little 58 acres. So he took them out to the property, and they made the down payment almost immediately. And the property closed the following March of 1920. So what they did, though, was really clever, I think, is that rather than trying to get a huge tract of land, they got one tract, and then as the adjoining lands became available and up for sale, they purchased it, until at the height they had about 1,300 acres. It's now down to about 1,200 because there's highways and byways and roads and things that have been severed off to make space for the expansion of the area. So what do we do with this land? What do we do now that we have this property? Well, one of the things that they did was they didn't tear down the existing buildings. They made use of the buildings as they were until they were ready to build. And Rickert kind of became the chief of all of this. He oversaw it. He had the skill set. He knew people. And let's face it, knowing people sometimes is as important as doing it yourself or having the initial plan. So he writes in a number of articles, or a number of articles that are written, he says it just grew. There's no real, there is a master plan, don't get me wrong. But rather than waiting until they could encompass the whole master plan, they did things in stages. They responded to how things happened. One of the things that happened, if you know anything about North American history in the 1930s, was that there was a huge drought, which was part of the Great Depression. And unfortunately, the trees started to die off. But gee, let's see, what kind of trees are these? They're black walnut. These are valuable. So as the drought hit and as it became clear that they would not have enough water to save these trees, that the weather would not provide that, they cut the trees down. At the time of the writing of Unity's Golden 50 Years by Dana Gatlin, which came out in 1933, the wood was still being seasoned so that it could be made into furniture, so that it could be used on site. So already Rickert had this concept of, restoring and reusing and recycling before, it became popular and kind of chic to do so. One of my favorite things that Rickert did was he created, now these are the old fountains. If you've been to Unity Village more recently, that's not what they look like. This is how they looked when I was going through school. And what was interesting was until the 1990s, this was the chiller. If the fountains weren't working, it was hot as heck in the buildings because there was no AC. And he had them set up that if it was an extremely hot day, it clearly wasn't too hot a day because the fountains would rise up higher so that the water could do its job more effectively. So you could just look out a window and see how high the fountain was blowing, and that would tell you how hot it was outside. And let me tell you, having been at Unity Village in the summer, it can get pretty stinking hot, which is wonderful, but I'm not a big humid person, and it was hot. But this is one of the things he did, this idea of creating, and you don't know how he came up with the idea. I would like to think that, he got silent. He clearly was a spiritual person, and that he just came up and said, okay, how am I going to do this? Went into prayer as his father before him and said, aha, we can use water to cool things and make it beautiful while we're at it. From Charles Fillmore, our co-founder in Christian Healing, which came out in 1905, to allow the imagination to drift in daydreams never brings anything to pass. Ideas must be worked up into living, breathing, thinking things, no more so than the tower. And some folks say, oh, it's just this beautiful landmark. It's become the symbol of Unity. I have experienced where I've been at Unity Village pre-GPS and had the kind of map that a rental car agency gives you, which if you've had one of those from the late 90s, early 2000s, isn't particularly useful. But I would see the light of the tower, that blinking red light off in the distance, and I knew I was headed in the right direction. But what did Rickert do with this? He says, while the tower was built for utilitarian purposes, it is something more than that. It is a symbol of universal supply. We needed water to operate the farm, and every time we drilled for water, we got oil and gas. What a challenge to have. So they ended up damming up one of an artificial lake to provide the water supply for Unity Farm as it was then. In 1927, it was completed. So they needed to get elevation to get the water up so you would have some water pressure. And then he added, just because he had the space, rather than just having a water tower, he added 7 stories of office space below it. At the time, that was the reception area. That was that was your first experience of being greeted at Unity Village. And they had an area so that they could sell their farm products. They had jams, they had jellies. Apparently, it's still one of the best places to buy apple butter because they've resourced that and they've got the gardens up and running again in an organic way. So, I mean, it's amazing to me that so many of the things we've done in the past are coming back into expression as we realize and as we imagine, how are we going to deal with climate change? How are we going to deal with these challenges of wanting good, healthy food that's locally available? So thank you, Rickert, for making things set in place so that we could do that. One of his great achievements was building this little house called the Arches for his parents. And it's, as you can see, it's quite cute. It looks like it's straight out of a fairy book, an English fairy book. Said it's based on a Cotswold cottage. And Myrtle would say that Charles always wanted to make a kitchen because Rickert had not put a kitchen in. And I love Myrtle's comment about her husband. I do wish the fairy home to remain as it is, filled with food for thought and inspiration and blessings, but not the kind that makes stacks of dishes to wash. One of the other things that Rickert did that just took some imagination and just to me is such an expression of imagination in action is after World War II, supplies, labor, the whole enchilada is very, very restricted. So he took to pre-forming a lot of the concrete. And some of the things that look like they're stone are actually tinted concrete. And there was so successful in the late 40s, early 1950s, that other people came to Unity Village to see, or Unity Farm, to see what it was Rickert was doing and how he was doing it. They actually made the molds on site and then brought it to the location. And some of the areas, they actually put the windows into the mold so that everything was one solid structure, which is a good thing if you're in Tornado Alley. So as you can see, it's just this, put a piece here. It's like building blocks. And had I not known this, I wouldn't have thought that this was how they built the administrative building. It doesn't look like that. It looks like something else. So here are Rickert and Lowell and the final model of the admin building. So they not only did things like this, but Rickert had found an area that was nice and sheltered, and he put a garage there. It was easily accessible. And then they got thinking, and he's like, well, I have all this space above the garage. And he built a platform, and that became the amphitheater. And as things grew and as demand became greater, they moved what had been a small tea room over to where it was in the admin building. Again, it was like a day trip for folks in Kansas City to come down, see the beauty of it, see how he had designed it, not just for the food. So there were all of these things where it was important to look at how to make it beautiful, how to make it functional, and how to express himself in this way. On the left is an interesting picture. I found this in the archives many years ago, and I questioned because I looked at it and I'm like, that's not how Unity Village looks. That was a plan they had in the early 60s to have a Montessori-based school that would go from kindergarten through university. Now, it was decided that that really wasn't the mission of the Unity movement, but I find it interesting that they had at least gone so far as to make a model, discuss it, done some financial analyses, figured out how to make it work, even though in the end they had to let go of that vision. But just to allow themselves that luxury of being able to say, what if? What would this look like? And I think right now, as we're coming out of, touch wood, the COVID pandemic, we're all kind of in this space of what's next? What's it going to look like? How am I going to adjust? What needs to be adjusted? What do we not change? What do we not go back to? And thank you, Vesna, for this picture. So this is something that, has been a blessing. I find it interesting. On the right side, lower part of the picture is the new Silent Unity building, which was opened in 1989. And some folks I was talking to before they opened it were like, oh, well, they shouldn't have put property there. They should have left the green space. But when I was in the archives doing research, I discovered that Rickert had a plan for a building in that spot, shaped relatively similar to what they put there. So the vision was maintained. And it's truly Rickert's vision of how to make something spiritual functional. In the obituary published in October of 1965, he wanted to express his faith in steel and stone, in grassy terraces and tree-shaded gardens, to build a home for unity somewhere in the country where employees and visitors could work, play, and enjoy recreation together. Unity Village, as it stands today, is the living expression of his dream. And I, for one, am so grateful that Rickert not only tapped into his imagination, but that he allowed it to be expressed, that he didn't say, oh, that's too big. Oh, that can't be done. Oh, we're in a drought. Oh, we're in at the end of World War II and there's no money, there's no labor, there's no supplies. His imagination allowed him to tap into other ways of doing things so that his dream could come into reality. So I thank you for listening. And now, as we prepare for meditation, we will listen to Marcy Verk sing This Inner Space.
This inner space has the power to set me free. It's the cavern of creation and the truth of you and me. This inner space, an eternity of time. It's the moment of the holy now and the allness that is mine. This inner space contains all that I need. From deep within the invisible flows the living air I breathe. This inner space is flowing in my bones. It stirs my heart, it stirs my mind, and every prayer I've ever known. I say, breathe, just breathe. Now breathe this peace, this inner space is the ocean of your soul. And when you feel most broken, the truth is you are whole. This inner space connects us one to all, and though it would never push you, it will break down every wall. So I say, just breathe. Now breathe this peace. This inner space invites us to renew. In all my endless choosing, I become the chosen to this inner space. It never knows the past. In a quiet place you can hear it, and it might just make you laugh. So I say, breathe, just breathe. Now breathe
Oh, what a great song to bring us into meditation. And let us join heart to heart, hand to hand, soul to soul. In the oneness that we are, breathing into that space where we feel the connection. However we phrase it, we might call it God, we might call it oneness, we might call it our divine nature, the Christ, the Buddha nature. Whatever we call that spot within our physical body where we feel connected to the universal, eternal life force. And breathing into this space, let us acknowledge the imagination that has brought us to this place in our lives. The imagination that has helped us to co-create relationships, our jobs, our families, who we are, how we express ourselves. That part that when others see a handwriting or a piece of artwork, they say, ah, I know that person. And as we move from thinking about the imagination in the past, let us breathe into using our imagination to co-create the future. A future where we all are equal. A future where we all have access to the things we need. A future where we can promise to our Indigenous communities never again, and we will not forget. Imagination brings us this opportunity to see the future in a different way that honors the past, that does not allow us to forget in a way that would cause it to happen again, but to find empathy, to find ways of saying, oh, that's a red flag. Let's not do that. It didn't work in the past and it won't work again. Let us find ways to reach out to our brothers and sisters and persons who do not identify as a specific gender. Let us find ways of imagining how we reach out to each other regardless of our color, regardless of our creed, regardless of our economic status, regardless of what we believe. As Emily Cady described, we live as on a wheel and God is at the hub. And where it might seem like we're at crossroads to each other, we are actually all headed in the same way. We're walking each other home to that space where we can express the greatest expression of the oneness that we are. And breathing into that vision, breathing into that concept, we allow our hearts to say yes. We allow our minds to say yes. We allow our imagination to say yes. Yes, I can imagine a beautiful world. I can imagine a safe world. I can imagine a world of peace and harmony. I can imagine a world of prosperity where the living is made easier because we all share. And breathing. Let us take a few moments in the silence and allow our inner imagination to co-create this image. And to any anxieties that might rise up that say, but, What about? We say, peace be still. Divine imagination expressing through me and as me makes all things well. Breathing into that. We are divine imagination in expression. And for this time together, for this opportunity to move away from the noise and the chaos and allow our imagination to just flow wild, we are so grateful. And so it is, and so it shall be. Amen.
This is my